Hi everyone. Today we'll be talking about the critical theories or the constructivist theories of international relations. And our major objective in this presentation is to understand what the examples of these critical theories are. What are the major assumptions of the critical theories? How do these assumptions play out in international relations? How can we identify, understand these critical constructivist theories of international relations? And who are some of the proponents of these theories as well? So, the critical theories, as opposed to the realist and the liberal theories, are more radical, transformative theories of international relations because they argue, they argue a more radical, they argue a shift, a complete transformation from the way that the realists or the liberals perceived or viewed interactions among states in the international system. So the critical theory is a more radical theory, and it is used most times interchangeably with constructivism because constructivism is one major theory of it's one major critical theory, and so sometimes it is used as a synonym or it is used interchangeably with the critical theory. So you can either call it critical theory or constructivist theory, and of course the constructivist or the critical theories argue on two major issues, which are identity and beliefs. Identity, of course, are worldviews, are perspectives, orientations that people have about themselves, or people have about other people, other groups. Beliefs are essentially values, norms, that guide interactions, that guide our day-to-day lives and how we live and interact with others. So these are two very important elements of the critical constructivist theory. Unlike the other theories or the other group of theories of IR, realist and liberal, the critical theories also also highlight the major issues, the major concerns, that the other theories highlight: power, interest, democracy, rule of law, human rights, and all the other issues. But the critical theory argues for these issues or argues about these issues from a standpoint of the meanings ascribed to these concepts, the meanings that these concepts have, not necessarily whether these concepts are objective or subjective or how they play out, but necessarily or most importantly, about what they mean. And we'll find out why the meanings are very important to critical theories as we move along in this presentation. Now, the critical theories assume that the end of the Cold War was a very important point, in international relations. Remember, the realist theory argued that realism, became more prominent after the First World War. The collapse of the League of Nations, and the fact that there was fear and apprehension among states, as to the survival, the strength, the integrity of these states, and of course how they could go about ensuring that they remain relevant in the international scene, especially since the League of Nations had failed. And so the collapse of the League of Nations after the First World War was what propelled the growth of realism. And so also it is with liberalism. Liberalism became more emphasized after the Second World War. The United Nations was formed, other international organizations were formed, regionalism began to take root. And so it became more realistic that cooperation was possible. And so liberalism, you know, began to grow after the Second World War. And so it is with the critical theories. The critical theories became more prominent at the end of the Cold War in 1990. Of course, international relations scholars were skeptical about the Cold War coming to an end. Many IR scholars thought that the world will remain in a bipolar structure with the East and the West, being constantly in power, in tussle, you know, over the capitalist and socialist systems of government or systems of economics. And so the end of the Cold War propelled, or the end of the Cold War saw a very unique, a very interesting situation, where higher scholars began to rethink and to ask themselves questions about how is reality constructed, what is the role of the individual, what is the role of how the individual thinks, discussions, interactions that the individual has, and what functions do these play in how we come about the reality that we live in. And so some of the assumptions of the critical theory are the fact that the world and reality that we know, the world we live in, are socially constructed by our beliefs, by our ideas, by interactions, how we express these ideas and beliefs, and all that. And of course, they also argue that if the world can be constructed, if society is constructed, it means that we can always reconstruct society. And that's where meanings of concepts come into play. Concepts are given meanings or concepts are given meanings by individuals. And so if we ascribe a different meaning to certain concepts, and we insist on those new meanings over time, that's what those concepts will begin to mean. And so the constructivists argue that we can always reconstruct and deconstruct society, depending on the ideas that we express and how these ideas are expressed. Constructivists also emphasize the importance of social norms, social values, ethics, and the reason is because social norms are what motivate and propel our actions, our reactions to issues. The fact that we are Christians, we claim to be morally upright people. We claim to be people who love, who are compassionate. These norms and values, beliefs are what propel and motivate our actions, our reactions to issues. And so it's important how these social norms are formed, what kind of social norms are formed, because these are the kind of norms, or these are the kinds of, these are the foundation upon which society would eventually be built. And of course, constructivists also argue that states can have multiple identities, multiple beliefs, and ideologies, based on who they interact with and at what point they interact and what is the objective of such interactions. So these are some of the assumptions of the constructivist or the critical theories of international relations. And I want us to take note of the fact that reality, or the world as we know it, is socially constructed. That's what that's what the constructivists argue. The world is socially constructed. And of course, if it can be constructed, it can either be deconstructed or reconstructed. And what is the tool for these? Our beliefs, our ideas, our discussions, interactions, and how these ideas are expressed. Some of the major theories of the critical group, are feminism, Marxism, behavioralism, the fourth world theory, which are more contemporary critical theories. The new war theory also is a more contemporary theory, and you might want to add the constructivist theory as well, which we have talked about and said that it argues about the importance, emphasizes the importance of ideas, of discussions, and how these ideas and discourses can help to either construct, reconstruct, or deconstruct society. All right. Now we'll take these theories one after the other. The feminist theory is one theory that has received so much attention in the recent international relations discussion. The feminist theory basically argue that traditional international relations, the realist, the liberal thinkings about international relations have subsumed women, as a subcategory of of society. So women and men are not on the same footing. That's what the traditional international relations scholars or thinking has or emphasizes that women and men are not on the same are not in the same category in society, and so women seem to be a subcategory of society while men are the more dominant actors. You know, so the feminist theories are trying to change this traditional thinking of international relations to say that women are not are not are not good enough. I mean, they cannot remain a subcategory. Women also have to assume an equal playing ground, an equal playing field with men in the scheme of things, in international relations. Some feminist scholars also argue that traditional international relations, have located women as in a separate sphere of influence, domestic life, and separate from, the political life, from the religious life, you know, and what have you. And this is more prominent with the realist liberal theories as well, because we know that in traditional African societies, women played a very critical role in almost every aspect, even in security. Women played a critical role in many of the aspects of society. But with globalization and, of course, the growth of the realist and the liberal perspectives of international relations, that role of women have been subjugated. And so feminists are trying to argue against these traditional ideas of international relations and insist that women also have, a very important role to play, a very important contribution to make, you know, to international relations, and of course how nations interact with one another. Some of the recent feminist studies, or researches, arguments have bordered around what is the role of women in war and peace narratives. How many women are involved in peacekeeping forces, how many women are involved in the armed forces, how many women are involved in conflict resolution, in peace building, in peacekeeping. How many women are involved in development, whether it is political development or economic development or social development. What is the role of women, in all these facets of society? And of course, how do we view human rights from a feminine perspective? What aspects of human rights are more peculiar to the female gender? All right. So these are some of the emphasis of recent feminist arguments, researches, studies. And the bottom line is the fact that women, have vehemently opposed the traditional thinking of IR that elevates the men and puts them or makes them major actors, major players in the international scene, while women, are a subjugated category of actors. Feminist theory has argued against this and said that women and men must be given equal opportunities, to contribute and make an impact in international relations. Marxism is the second critical theory, and the Marxist theory argues it essentially from an economic, material perspective. The Marxist argument is the fact that the economy, the way the economy is structured, has led to the creation of classes in society. So society has been divided into two major classes: the wealthy or the bourgeoisie on the one hand, and the proletariat, on the other hand. And this class structure is a consequence of the kind of economy that has been or that is being practiced in society. So the Marxists argue that economics, is a very key indicator of the kind of relationships that go on, not just within states, but even between states as well, or among states. In international relations, how states interact with one another also It's a consequence of the economies or the economic situation, the economic structures within such societies, within such states as well. And these concerns have also can or have the potential of leading to conflict. All right. So if these economic issues are not properly managed, conflicts can occur. And the Marxists have argued that one of the major reasons why conflicts are a major indices in international relations is because of the economic structure, the the unequal economic structure that exists in international relations. That has been a major source of especially intrastate conflicts and even interstate conflicts that we have seen and experienced in international relations. Some of the assumptions of the Marxist theory are the fact that globalization, the capitalist globalization, is unequal and has resulted in some kind of instability within the state. So the states or the states, individuals within the states are insecure. You know, they are they are feeling they're actually feeling excluded, and they're feeling that their desires, their needs have not been, or they have not been given opportunities to explore and achieve their full potentials. And this has been a result of capitalist globalization, where the rich has continued to get rich and the poor has remained poor. All right. As a result of several policies, several programs that have been emphasized by this capitalist global campaign. All right, we have mentioned the two classes that exist, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And of course, there's also a struggle, around material needs, around exploitation. There's a constant struggle. These classes are constantly in competition, are constantly in struggle, are constantly, at loggerheads because one class feels it's exploited by the other class. And so this is a major challenge that states grapple with. And of course, it is one challenge that also influences how states perceive themselves, how states interact. You will find out that these theories, feminist theory, Marxist theory, is not essentially talking about issues of power, issues of national interest. These are a different set of issues. That's why we are calling them critical theories. They are a shift from the emphasis on competition and cooperation that the realists and the liberals have argued, and they are involving other issues, other equally important issues in international relations that are not necessarily or that do not necessarily have to do with power or national interest and those kinds of issues. All right, so just like we said, the new realists, see that the world is competitive because the world is structured in a very complex, form, and of course the world is structured in a form where there's no overarching authority, so everyone is disposed to fight for their survival. The neoliberals also see the world as um, as as cooperative or cooperating, insists that there has to be cooperation because of the complex interdependence that exists. So both the neo-realists and the neoliberals argue from the point of structure. The structure of the system is what has either propelled competition or propelled cooperation. So they see the structure from a political perspective, whereas the Marxists see structure, also talk about structure. Remember, the structure of society is what either propels the fights, the exploitation that goes on among the classes. The structure of the system is what has resulted in some feeling insecure and others, having to get away with much of the wealth of society. So the Marxists see structure from an economic perspective. That's the point we're making here. The Marxists see structure from an economic perspective. So they argue about the economic structure of the system, whereas the neo-realists and the neoliberals argue about the political structure of the system, which of course are entirely different different arguments. All right. So those are the major arguments of the Marxist theory of international relations, which of course we have said is one of the critical theories of IR as well. The behavioral theory is another very important theory, and of course this theory argues that behavior, can be scientifically studied. So we can actually subject human behavior to scientific research. That's the argument of the behavioral theory. We can observe people, how people behave. We cannot see how they think. We cannot see what beliefs they hold. We cannot see what actions are in their minds, but we can see what actions they carry out on a daily basis. We can see how they react to issues, how they respond to certain questions or discussions. We can see. And so these aspects of behavior that we can see, we can actually subject them to scientific study. All right, that's what the behavioralists argue. And of course, we also know that behavior is not constant. Behavior is not predictable. All right, behavior can change. Behavior can be modified. Behavior can be learned and unlearned. So this also brings us back to social constructions. Individuals, by way of the ideas they have, by way of the interactions they have with others, they can decide to adopt a particular kind of behavior or stop a particular kind of behavior, and things like that. So these are some of the characteristics that have qualified the behavioral theory to become a critical theory of international relations. Okay, because it centers around behavior, which is not constant, it's not static. It is also subject to change, to reconstruction, deconstruction, and construction, as it were. And of course, in all these theories, you can always see the proponents or the major scholars who have propounded, who have argued and expanded these theories. You can see them reviewed on the screen as well. The fourth world theory is another major critical theory of international relations, and just like the name implies, fourth world theory. This theory basically, or this term, the term fourth world, refers to political groups, entities that are within a state. So, for instance, ethnic identities, ethnic groups, and these kinds of groups that are within the state are groups that are referred to as fourth world, as the fourth world. Of course, you know that we have the third world, which are underdeveloped countries or states. The fourth world is a new concept that seems to identify groups, ethnic identities that are within the state boundaries. All right, and so the emphasis of the fourth world theory is that these distinct nations, these distinct ethnic groups, have been distorted, have been invaded, have been violated. Their cultures, their customs, their practices have been completely altered, by a forceful incorporating of these entities into the larger state. And of course, we have a very practical understanding of this theory from an African perspective. African states are basically a collection of several ethnic groups, into that were forcefully merged into states, and so that has been the nature of African politics. So we would naturally identify with this kind of theory, and so the argument of the fourth world theory is the fact that indigenous identities, indigenous people, indigenous beliefs do exist, and that these indigenous identities and beliefs have been distorted, have been altered, by an incorporation of these identities and ethnic groups into the larger global system, and these kinds of forceful incorporation is what has resulted in the various wars that we have had, ethnic wars, ethnic cleansing, genocide, refugees, refugee crisis, human rights violations. All of these are issues that have resulted directly or indirectly from the distortion, the forceful distortion, from the alteration, you know, that these fourth world entities have experienced or have been subjected to. Okay, so the fourth world theory, basically argues that we have to change the way the world is. I mean, the fourth world theory doesn't just want to explain how the world operates or describe how the world exists, but it's arguing that fourth worlds, being ethnic identities, ethnic nations, nationalities, indigenous groups, must be allowed to develop at their own pace, must be allowed to experiment with their own systems of government, systems of justice, systems of systems of legislation, and all the other systems that there are possible. They must be allowed to exercise and experiment, indigenous practices that are not handed down forcefully to them by the larger global society. So those are the major arguments of the fourth world theorists. Okay, and of course you have several groups of people who argue from the fourth world perspective. They could be lawyers. They could be. I mean, you almost find fourth world theorists in almost every facet of life, and the argument basically is that indigenous societies, indigenous cultures, and practices must be given preeminence. Must be allowed to they must be allowed to exist and flourish as much as possible within the international system. And of course, there are critiques to all of these theories. I'm sure you are thinking of some of the critiques. How does this work? What are the downsides to these kinds of thinking, to these kinds of perspectives? How can we emphasize? How can we promote these kinds of thinking, and what are the limitations? I'm sure you are thinking of some of these because there are limitations to these theories. And then finally, we have the New War theory. The New War theory. This theory is a very simple and straightforward theory, which, of course, like the others, are equally simple and straightforward. And this theory argues that warfare in the contemporary times are an entirely different issue from warfare in the traditional international relations. They are different in the sense that the casualties are different, the strategies of warfare are different, the methods, for strategies, the means, the strategies as well. The equipment that are used in fighting these warfares are also different. And so the cost is different. The entire enterprise of warfare, in contemporary international relations, is an entire departure from what we used to have in the traditional international relations setting. That's the argument of the New World Theory. And so they're arguing that the war there's a war economy. There's a war economy, and the war economy has to do with a kind of profit system where certain individuals profit from violence in other places. Certain individuals are profiting because certain individuals or certain other groups are in conflict, and those are the only times they can sell their intelligence they have, they can sell their technical skills, they can sell the weapons they have, and what have you. So there's a global war economy that has continued to sustain the incidents of wars. And of course, these wars have become more dynamic, more complicated, more devastating, and more dangerous, with higher consequences. So these are some of the reasons why wars have persisted. The various ethnic groups and the various ethnic tensions and divisions that we see across the world. The growth and advancement in Western technological inventions or interventions, in terms of technology, whether it's transport technology or weapons technology or space technology, all of these technology, nuclear technology, all these interventions have helped to further complicates the nature of warfare. There's a global arms market. People have access to weapons now more easily than it were or than it was during the traditional international relations era. Perhaps in the First, Second World War period, there wasn't as much access to weapons as there are today. Okay, so all of these issues, have resulted in several other consequences: identity politics, refugees crisis, hunger, poverty, and what have you. Migration, of course, is one of the major issues that are resulting from wars and violence today. Okay, so of course, like we said, the nature or the form of violence has changed, characterized now by genocide, displacements. There are new militias. There are guerrilla groups, there are militant groups, there are civilian groups. Civilian, not non-military groups that have become very violent and that have taken up arms even against the state. And in some cases, these groups are even more powerful or more, they are standing up to the state. Just to put it lightly, they are standing up to the state in terms of carrying out their violent campaign against the state. And of course, the nature of funding too is also very, very interesting. The nature of funding these various violent groups is also very interesting, particularly even terrorist groups, terrorist fundamentalist groups. How do they raise their funds? How do they stay in business? How do they restock their arms, the supplies, food, and all of that are also very, very interesting conversations. Of course, states are involved sometimes in even sponsoring these terrorist activities. Individuals are involved, organizations are involved. Sometimes the social media is a very, very useful tool for recruitment, for fundraising, and what have you. So the nature of warfare generally has changed. That's the point we're making. And that is a consequence of the various opportunities that exist, the various structures that are in place now, that have made these possible. Of course, the victims of this warfare are most of the time they're civilians and vulnerable population as well. Women, children, the aged, disabled. These are some of the highest casualties in this warfare because these people are vulnerable, and they are easy prey. They are easy targets in such warfare. So these are some of the critical theories of international relations. We've talked about the feminist theory. We've talked about the Marxist theory. We've talked about the behavioral theory. We've talked about the fourth world theory, which we said has to do with indigenous groups that are within the states. And we have talked about the new world theory as well, and the constructivist theory. So these are some of the critical theories of international relations. And remember, we said that what qualifies these as critical theories of international relations is the fact that they argue on separate issues. They emphasize separate issues that are not necessarily related to state survival, struggle for power, national interest, democracy, balance of power, and all of those issues that the realist and the liberal theories emphasize. The critical theories are emphasizing a different set of issues, which of course are also important to the discussion and the interactions that states have with one another. All right. So in conclusion, we're saying that critical theories are a set of more radical theories that argue that reality is simply designed by human thoughts, human ideas, human discourse, beliefs, identities. These are the things that socially construct the realities that we see and that we know. We have said that constructivism is one major critical theory, and sometimes they can be used simultaneously. We have talked about some of the major assumptions. We've talked about the assumptions. Yeah, we talked about some of the examples of the critical theories, and of course the proponents of those theories were also mentioned, you know. And it's important to note, on a final note, that even though the constructivist theory is more radical, it's more transformative, it doesn't undermine, the role of the state. It doesn't dismiss the arguments of the realists or the liberal categories of theories, because remember we said that theories are neither right or wrong. Theories are more or less appropriate, are more or less appropriate. So the appropriateness of a theory is what makes it strong, and theories can be appropriate or inappropriate depending on what argument is being made. So all these three categories of theories are rightly theories of international relations, and they are very useful depending on what argument is being made at what point in time and by whom and where. So it's important that we bear this in mind and that we understand that all of these theories are simply lenses, mirrors, windows through which we can view the world, through which we can understand how people think, through which we can understand how people respond or how people can likely respond to issues, through which we can understand how people behave, how states behave, why states do what they do, and of course we can better analyze international relations through these various lenses. We're going to have to end this presentation at this point. And if you have questions, if you have concerns, comments, of course, we can continue the conversation via my contact details. Thank you so much for listening.